So when it comes to world building, I think one thing that is really important to consider that maybe people don't consider right away is the time period of the book, because time period can radically change how your book feels. And I'm not just talking about like medieval versus modern day, right? Like obviously high fantasy is pretty classically set in this medieval kind of general era, this, Dungeons and Dragons kind of feel to it. But even with fantasy, you can put it in so many different kinds of timelines. For that classic future science fiction feel, actually, Project Ito's Harmony is one that definitely is more classic. It's in our world, but it's in the future, and it's dealing a lot with specifically the science aspect, these nanobots that could potentially take over people's very sentience. And this book has an interesting motif in which things are written in HTML at times. There are things written in HTML in code to signify that kind of, inhumanity of the characters and the world that they live in. And so that's an example of very classic science fiction, but there are other things you can do with it. Where it becomes science fiction is specifically when it starts dealing with aspects of science. So reasonably, you could also put a fantasy book in the future, and you could put a science fiction book in the past. I mean, after all, we have all heard of Steampunk, which is very much a more sci-fi bent kind of genre, but it has that Victorian aesthetic. And that changes a lot of things. We go from, spaceships and all that kind of stuff, aliens, to a more mad inventor kind of feel. It's something that, depending on the themes of your book and the characters in it, can work with the story and also work against it if you're choosing a setting that isn't quite right for the story. But there are plenty of examples of books like fantasy books that don't take place in a medieval setting. For instance, my favorite book and my favorite story in general is Stardust. And Stardust is really great. It takes place in a more Victorian era England, and there's a lot of the elements of classic high fantasy to it, but it also takes place technically in our world. It combines a lot of English folklore and, other kinds of things like that, witches and magic and all of that, and it puts it in a time frame that we can very easily grasp and understand. Our main character is the son of a shopkeeper in this small kind of Victorian town. He really likes this girl. Girl doesn't like him that much, so one day he just pops across this wall, there's a hole in it, and he discovers a crazy magical landscape on the other side. But in terms of fantasy, there is actually an entire genre called Decopunk, and Decopunk is really cool because what it is like Art Deco is the 1930s. There's also Dieselpunk for the 40s and 50s, so on and so forth, but Decopunk is actually what I was planning on setting a very large own world high fantasy in, because to me, Decopunk really has all of these themes of like extravagance, over the top, think like Great Gatsby kind of existence, that 20s, 30s kind of party life and all of the social life and all these kinds of things, like the lights and the music and all of it, right? Like old money, new money, Decopunk is where it's at. And there is actually a fantasy book that has a Decopunk setting, and that is Amberlau. This is a 3-book series that deals with themes of fascism and things in its own world, but is very much, as you can see from the art, that kind of Art Deco 1930s aesthetic. And it really does add to it, because in the real world, 1930s is when all that really bad fascist stuff started picking up, and it translates very well into a whole different world too. You will hear it said so often in writing that everything's already been done and nothing's new. But the reality is, for every different element of world building, you have an opportunity to take something that has already been done and refashion it so that it at least feels new. And for me, with time period, this is exactly where you can do that. Of course, we've seen elemental magic before, and of course we've seen, humans in a magic race before, and of course we've seen theocracies and magic societies and all these things before. But when you put it in a 1930s-esque setting, it feels a lot different, and the characters become a lot different too. In the book that I am writing, in the series that I'm writing, the characters, they have these archetypes that we've seen many, many times, but the way they present themselves in a more 1930s setting is a lot different than how they're usually portrayed. And that is something that made me choose that time period specifically, because the themes of that era lined up exactly with the themes of the book, the things that I'm trying to convey. All of that extravagance and that, you know, us versus them and just over the top aesthetic, that's kind of the heart of the book, and the setting and the time period reflects that. And it's important to mention that while, you know, time period is part of setting, it is still a different thing. For instance, 1930s on a farm is very different from 1930s in New York City. So that's still a separate discussion regarding setting, but what matters is that, you know, also as you're picking your time period, you're also considering what limitations and advantages that gives your characters. So if it's the medieval era, they don't have things like phones, they don't have things like, you know, flashlights or any other kind of technology. If it's the future, they might have some kind of issues with things like religion that seem superstitious and boring. With writing, there is no one way to do anything, and in popular fiction, where genre really matters, once again, I will tell you, every genre has like a billion subgenres. So if you want to write fantasy, but it's in 1930s, Decopunk. It's already there for you. There are so many labels for everything that you want to do that you really don't have to worry about getting outside the bounds of what people would want to publish and sell. There's plenty available to you. And so my advice is not to let, you know, the actual genre constraints take away from your creativity and take away from what you could do with something as simple as the decade in which your characters are walking through. So with that in mind, I hope this kind of, you know, maybe helps you undo a bit of a block that you were having, or maybe it makes you think of all the possibilities that you could do with an unconventional time period. But nonetheless, I'll see you guys next week for a bit of mythology, and I hope you have a great holiday, and I'll see you then. Bye. By the way, if you want to see these videos 2 weeks earlier, consider subscribing to my Patreon, where you not only get all these videos, but also recipe cards, specific deity profiles, and lots of other interesting things to look at. Video tiers start at $10 a month, so definitely consider checking it out.